Hi, I'm Jenna Roll. I'm the Director of Education at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History NC Center. Welcome to Science Pub, Science Pub from home. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kaitlyn Gaynor. Dr. Gaynor is a wildlife ecologist whose research is focused on understanding the role that humans play in ecological systems, including the impacts of human activity on animal behavior and species interactions. She received her Ph.D. from the University of California, Berkeley, and for the last 2 years, she has been based here in Santa Barbara at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis as a postdoctoral fellow. Dr. Gaynor has studied a wide range of mammal species, including black-tailed deer in California and African elephants in Mozambique. Her current work is focused on synthesizing global data sets on animal movement and activity. Kaitlyn, thank you for joining us tonight. When you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to you all for joining. Okay, so thanks to everyone for joining today. I am really excited to share some ongoing work that my colleagues and I are conducting and some other anecdotes and studies relating to the impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic on wildlife. And I know we're probably thinking way too much about COVID and how it's affecting our own lives, but hopefully this work leaves you with a slightly different perspective on the pandemic and how it might be impacting other critters on the planet, and highlight some opportunities for conservation in its wake. So I am calling in, I'm in Santa Barbara right now, the homeland of the Chumash people, which is of course where the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History is located. I'm really grateful to the museum for the invitation to join you. And I do very much wish we could be in person at Dargan's, but I'm glad to be with you virtually. And I am based right now at NCEAS, which is located right downtown near the courthouse. And for those of you who aren't familiar with NCEAS, it stands for the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. I encourage you to check us out on our website or Twitter for more information. We have a mailing list you can sign up for. And we're an affiliate of UC Santa Barbara. And the center was established in 1995, and we recently moved into this beautiful new building on Anacapa Street. And at NCEAS, we work to accelerate scientific discoveries that will enhance our understanding of the world, of ecosystems, and also benefit people and nature. And I've been there for a little over 2 years as a postdoc studying the effects of human activity on biodiversity, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So as the human population is growing, our footprint is expanding globally, our actions are of course having a really big impact on other species with which we share the planet, which has implications for biodiversity conservation, and also, as we've learned, in a very real way, for human health. We still are working out the details of the origins of SARS-CoV-2, but last year's spillover of this novel coronavirus from animals to people, I think, has really placed the relationship between humans and wildlife under a global spotlight. And the pandemic has highlighted how biodiversity, nature, other species, and the ways in which we choose to interact with and protect biodiversity can impact human health in really real ways. And this widespread global upheaval that we've been experiencing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, has underscored further links between people and animals, and also highlighted some limitations in our conservation strategies that I'll be discussing today. And I think it's really important to understand these dynamics and to come out of this pandemic prioritizing biodiversity conservation so that we don't experience continued extinction and defaunation. And also that we recognize that this is an important way to stop future pandemics. And so I'm going to, this talk will kind of have a couple chapters. My colleagues and I are trying to understand what the consequences of this COVID pandemic are for wildlife, to learn lessons about designing more effective conservation strategies. And I'm first going to discuss some ongoing work on how we can use the pandemic as a natural experiment to shed light on how we can better manage wildlife and recreation in our national parks or protected areas in the United States. And then I'll zoom out in the second half of the talk to talk about global consequences of the pandemic for conservation. So quickly, just to kind of take us out of the pandemic context for a moment, I'm sure you are all familiar with our national parks. Here in the United States, the protected area model for wildlife conservation is one of the dominant strategies for conserving many of our country's vulnerable species. The National Park Service was created with this kind of tricky mission to conserve wildlife and wild lands and to provide for the enjoyment of those lands and scenery for present and future generations. And it's often called this dual mandate of the National Park Service. And it's becoming harder and harder to reconcile given really rapid increases in visitation to US national parks. This figure shows the number of visitors across all national parks from the inception of the national park system to the present day. And we can see a rise, especially within the last decade, after there was a little bit of a plateau at the end of the last century, but it's really taking off again. And this has raised a lot of important questions about the impacts of visitors on the wildlife that we're meant to be conserving in these parks and how we can sustain both of these goals in perpetuity. So recreation can have a number of negative effects on wildlife. These are pretty well documented. The first is just animals are scared of people and they usually avoid us. And previous work in national parks has documented animals changing the habitats that they're using, the way that they're moving, what they're eating, the times of day that they're active in response to hiking, camping, physical infrastructure. And recreation-induced changes in behavior can also scale up to alter survival and reproduction or animal fitness by stressing these animals out so much that it impacts their body condition negatively, or reducing access to habitat that might be really great habitat, but they're just too scared to use it because people are around. And recreation can also disrupt reproduction itself. For example, birds might abandon their nests after being disturbed by people. And finally, animals are frequently struck by visitors' vehicles in national parks, and road mortality in the form of vehicle collisions is actually pretty widespread in the more popular parks. And so collectively, it's possible that these negative impacts of recreation on wildlife may be leading to population declines or holding populations at kind of lower levels than they would be in the absence of recreation, or important ecological dynamics might be interrupted as a result of these impacts on animals. And so we might be compromising that mission of conserving wildlife in the national parks by promoting that mission of ensuring visitor access. Some animal species, on the other hand, might benefit from visitors to our parks, particularly prey animals. If their predators are avoiding human activity, they might find it very appealing to be hanging out in areas where there's a lot of people because they're safer for them. So for example, in Glacier National Park, we see mountain goats sometimes spending time in areas near roads or where people are around, where they might be safer from the grizzly bears that don't really want anything to do with people. Animals might also find some food around people, or actually like urine in the case of those Glacier mountain goats. And so we might see this, I have it here listed as a benefit of human visitation and that the animal is kind of getting something from us being there, but it might not be desirable in the long term, given that this behavior might create conflict with people and may eventually lead to the removal of these animals for the sake of visitor safety. And so there are a lot of these underlying dynamics that are kind of difficult to tease apart. It's kind of hard to know the role that human recreation is having in our parks because there's so much else going on. But we were able to use this COVID-19 shutdown of our national parks last spring as a natural experiment. So across the national park system, visitation was way down last year. This graph just shows the percent change in visitors from 2020 as compared to the previous 3 years on average for every month of the year. And so you see January and February, it was actually a little bit above average and then just really dropped down, especially in April, May, and persisting throughout the summer. And many of you may have seen some of these headlines from last year about how wildlife in national parks were just thriving during lockdown, that the pandemic offered a reprieve for animals and really those that experienced those negative consequences of recreation. And so, these headlines kind of got our attention and led us to wonder, can we actually quantify this somehow and understand what the animals were doing while we weren't there? And across the national parks, a number of different animal species had been outfitted with GPS collars that were recording their locations for various other research and monitoring projects. And so with a team of researchers, I'm now compiling GPS data from tracked large mammals across all of our parks to see what they were doing and test some of these broader hypotheses about the effects of recreation on animals. And so by comparing how they changed their activity during COVID and how that response differed across these different species and across different parks, we can understand which species and sites are most affected by humans and allocate our conservation and visitor management efforts accordingly. And we can also understand a little bit more about differences among individual animals, which animals might be really comfortable with human activity and which ones might be really wary. And then by looking at how they're changing their movement before, during, and after the shutdown, we can understand how their ability to kind of bounce back from changes in their environment. And so I don't have results for you yet, I'm sorry, but we've got some preliminary data which suggests that in some cases, animals were moving into these areas of higher disturbance during the shutdown. This animation is showing 3 elk in Grand Canyon, which were hanging out in the village a lot during April and May. And I'm now in the process of quantifying various metrics of how big their ranges were and how fast they were moving and what times of day they were active throughout these parks to explore some of these questions. So stay tuned, hopefully we'll have some results out there soon. But we have seen just anecdotally a number of changes in the parks as a result of the pandemic shutdowns. So animals that previously would avoid areas of disturbance are now moving into them and using them a bit more. So as an anecdote, in bighorn sheep in Zion were seen at a campground for the first time since it was established in 1993. It was prime bighorn habitat. They were never there. As soon as the pandemic hit, they moved in. In Death Valley, pronghorn antelope were found in areas near roads where they've never seen before, possibly because there were fewer vehicles on those roads. Monk seals were hanging out on Hawaiian beaches because the tourists weren't. So we saw that animals perceived that change in human activity and did take advantage of it in some cases. It may have led to increased fitness, survival and reproduction. It's a little bit harder to quantify, but 2020 was a record year for breeding cormorants in Golden Gate National Recreation Area up in the San Francisco Bay, which was largely closed to tourists during their breeding times. There were a couple peregrine in Yosemite that were nesting in areas that were typically used by climbers during that shutdown period. So it may have had a kind of an impact just for 2020. And there were also a lot fewer animals killed on our roads in national parks. For example, bear collisions in Yosemite were way down. Amphibian roadkill during the spring vernal migrations up in Acadia and Maine seemed to be down based on some anecdotes. So there may have been a temporary reprieve in the spring of last year. For animals that benefit from human subsidies, we might expect their behavior and diet to change as well. Just as an anecdote from someone at the Grand Canyon, they said all the fat squirrels that used to hang out around the trails where people drop trail mix were all just really skinny and sad last year. They probably got a lot to eat again this year, though. I'm not too worried about them. And so beyond the national parks, this COVID-19 lockdown has offered a global opportunity to see what do animals do when people stay inside? And some scientists called this period the anthropause, last March through June 2020, when everything was shut down. And we're starting to see some interesting results of that work now coming out. For example, not too far away in the Santa Monica Mountains, Southern California, researchers were able to track the movement of mountain lions that they'd already been monitoring. And these mountain lions are very wary of people. They weren't taking over the streets of downtown LA. But the scientists did find that with fewer people out and about on all the trails, the mountain lions were much less disturbed in their habitats, and they were able to move around more efficiently. And they moved less, they weren't having to constantly dodge people and adjust to coexist in the same space. And so these findings during COVID shed light on what the typical effects of recreation on mountain lion behavior might be. We can kind of see measure that impact by looking at that shutdown period as kind of an experiment. The pandemic also revealed the role that human disturbance can play in maintaining ecological dynamics by changing animal behavior. In an island in the Baltic Sea in Sweden, tourists usually scare away white-tailed eagles. which allows these seabirds you see in this little video here, MERS, to nest in peace. But in 2020, when this video was taken, tourism was halted and the eagles made a comeback. You can see a couple of them flying by in this video. And the MERS all just were freaked out all the time. And it resulted in a lot fewer baby seabirds born that year. And so what this suggests is that human activity, that ecotourism to this island, has actually been tipping the scales of predator-prey interactions in this system by scaring all the predators away. Raises some questions about, what are our goals with conservation in these sites? What is kind of the natural state? What are we trying to manage for? And again, we might not have realized the impact that human visitation was having on nesting success without this kind of anomaly of a year. Now, while many of the national parks were shut down entirely in the spring, many of them experienced huge spikes in visitation last summer, and then also really this summer too, because people wanted to get outside. It was safer to be outside and people were going crazy, cooped up inside. I know I certainly spent my fair share of time in our parks. And many people were first-time park visitors too. And this spike in visitation often happened immediately after this complete shutdown, which led to some tension between people and animals in our protected areas. In some cases, animals had gotten used to these visitor-free parks, and they didn't always readily adapt to an increase in visitors. So for example, otters at Lassen National Park up in Northern California, during the shutdown, they set up a den in the lake, in this nice part of the lake. And then kayakers and swimmers started coming back in the summer, and the otters were just attacking them because they didn't want them in the lake. And they actually had to shut down that part of the lake so that the otters wouldn't be disturbed. And we also saw similar increases in conflict with black bears in several parks, for a lot of different reasons. The bears had established their routines, and then people came back in and they're like, oh, there's food here now, great. A lot of first-time campers didn't know how to store food properly. Many parks just didn't have adequate staff to clear out trash regularly, to scare bears away, to train people in food storage. And so we saw kind of a spike in human-wildlife conflict last summer in the aftermath of the shutdown as visitors increased. And so the pandemic and these associated changes in visitation that happened last year and this year too have provided a unique lens into the impacts of recreation on wildlife in our parks. And so based on the finding of this type of work, we can think about how to manage visitation in our parks, both in number and extent, like where visitors are going, to limit the impacts on sensitive species while still providing for recreation opportunities. I'm continuing to work with partners at the National Park Service to tease apart the dual mandate to understand the visitor side of things and the wildlife side of things, with the end goal of preserving these parks for future generations. And so I'll turn now to our second set of lessons from the pandemic. Take a much more broad and global approach to considering how we can develop more resilient global conservation and development strategies in its wake. So the pandemic and its fallout are affecting wildlife, not only by changing where people go or where they don't go in the case of the shutdown, but also by reshaping institutions and their policy priorities, by altering economies, global and local economies, and human livelihoods. And the disease itself and the policies that we've put in place to prevent both spread of COVID-19 and the future spillover of zoonotic diseases will also affect wildlife. And so with some colleagues, we set out to kind of disentangle what are all of these different pathways, what are we seeing, and what that might be learned from conservation. And so I've already talked a lot about this refuge effect, which got a lot of attention in the headlines, that the shutdowns were leading to reduced human activity, and these kind of like nature is healing memes, like the animals are reclaiming their space and everything is great because people are locked inside. And I think there are things we can learn about, as I said, the kind of typical impacts of human activity on animal behavior by studying these effects. But I don't think ultimately the outcome of the pandemic for wildlife is not going to be that they're all kind of happy and everything's kumbaya. As I said, it's actually led to some more conflict. And in many cases, these behavioral effects reverse themselves pretty quickly once people kind of started getting out and about more, animals, kind of avoided us again. And also, notably, while many people kind of hunkered down, a lot of other people moved around a lot as a result of this pandemic, especially leaving urban areas for rural areas as a result of job loss or concerns about disease. And then moving to these more rural areas, they might rely more on natural resources, on harvesting wild animals and wild plants. This is a photograph from India showing a mass exodus of people from urban areas back to their home communities at the start of the pandemic. And changing institutional dynamics, as I said, are likely to be really important in understanding COVID or conservation in a post-COVID world. During the pandemic, safety concerns related to the virus led to, and also disease, people getting sick, led to just reduced law enforcement and weakened local institutions on the ground. We saw reports, for example, of increased poaching in several places in Africa. And these efforts are still persisting, this weakened enforcement in conservation areas due to budget cuts. So recent surveys of park rangers from I think 60 different countries around the world, which the World Wildlife Foundation led, found nearly a third of rangers strongly agreed budget cuts had negatively affected their day-to-day work. And a lot of jobs were cut and haven't yet been recovered. And particularly in low-income countries, the economic fallout of the pandemic really highlighted an over-reliance, I think, of conservation on international ecotourism and aid. As international travel has really halted worldwide and funding has slowed, it's really taken a hit. 45% of international tourism destinations have closed their borders, costing an estimated $4.7 trillion in loss last year, and many jobs as well. And so I think a lesson here is that these conservation efforts that really rely on global economies may not be as well situated to mitigate these negative impacts and ride through shocks as efforts that invest in more locally managed institutions and are really motivated by local goals. Another way in which institutions have, changing institutional dynamics have influenced conservation is that at national scales, we've seen this a lot in Brazil and India, in the Trump era United States, that environmental regulations have been rolled back under the guise of economic recovery post-pandemic or during pandemic. I guess we're still during it. This figure here shows the number of legislative acts in Brazil that weakened environmental protection, and that red bar is the start of the pandemic. You can see just a huge spike in this anti-environmental legislation near the end of 2020, as politicians were saying, well, we need to prioritize the economy right now, not the environment. And then, of course, as a background to all of this, this global economic collapse is just probably a net negative for wildlife. We're seeing, we might see some potential benefits. Maybe at the beginning, wildlife trade slowed in some areas, some extractive industries were shut down, as when things were shut down. But on the whole, I think in the longer term, it's anticipated that these economic priorities are going to continue to take priority over conservation. And a lot of jobs in the conservation space have been lost as budgets have been cut. The disease itself may spill back into other species. There might actually be direct impacts of COVID on wildlife. We haven't really seen this yet. I've seen reports that a lot of deer in North America have COVID now, but don't appear to, or have the coronavirus, but don't appear to be sick. There are concerns about ecotourism with gorillas. Hopefully it won't be as lethal as it has been for other humans, but it still does remain a concern. What kind of diseases might we be giving back to wildlife that have harmful effects on them? And I think a really big question is how policies around wildlife trade and consumption are going to change in the wake of the pandemic as we think about how to prevent further outbreaks like this. There have been many debates in the public, in conservation communities, science communities, about what to do about wet markets and wildlife trade and wildlife consumption, with some calling for a total ban on wildlife consumption, others calling for more nuance. I would probably land a little more on that side, because I think that while many forms of wildlife trafficking and wildlife trade should certainly be stopped, the kind of blanket criminalization of wildlife consumption may have harm for vulnerable populations, weaken trust in institutions, and might not actually address the root problem. We saw that policies against bushmeat consumption in West Africa after the recent Ebola outbreak really actually kind of backfired. And so as an alternative, policies that work on mitigating the harmful effects of the wildlife trade while providing food and livelihood alternatives, not just making people criminals because they consume wild meat, will probably be more effective and equitable than universal bans. But this is going to be a really important continued conversation for conservation and human health in that interface. So the hope is that by disentangling all of these complex and interacting pathways that link the pandemic to wildlife outcomes, we can better understand the socio-ecological dynamics that link people, wildlife, and ecosystems experiencing this shock to facilitate more effective responses both to the current crisis and then also more sustainable policies going forward. And I just want to close by zooming into how these different global dynamics related to COVID play out at a household scale and influence decisions made by people, particularly in rural and poor households in low-income countries, and how those decisions might impact wildlife and other natural resources. And this is some work that was led by a colleague of mine at Cornell that we published last year, in which we drew on this natural capitals framework, which is used to understand how people balance a portfolio of capitals of social, human, financial, physical, and natural capitals to sustain themselves and cope with shocks. And I'll walk through what each of those are. But in this hypothetical scenario that I'm presenting here, a household might have some balanced portfolio of assets on these 5 axes. But when COVID hit, however, access to really all of these other types of capitals declined, and the use of natural capital has risen in a lot of communities. And so I'll walk through the pathways that might lead to that. So human capital, we're referring to the health, knowledge, education, capacity to work, human labor. And we've seen in a lot of other disease contexts around the world that a reduction in human labor can lead to declines in agricultural production. Communities with a lot of disease just can't produce as much food, which results in the need to hunt and forage wild animals and plants, especially in contexts like HIV, AIDS, chronic disease. We see this a lot. Also saw an increase in overharvesting in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak. And the ways in which people are harvesting those wild resources might change as well. Katie Fiorella, my colleague that led this work, found that in Kenyan fishing communities, people use more environmentally destructive fishing practices when they're sick because they're less physically able to engage in more sustainable practices. And so we might be seeing similar dynamics play out in the context of COVID as we learn more about the longer term effects of the disease. So we'll look out for more work in that space. Financial capital, which essentially refers to money, has also declined significantly. A big piece of it is in many parts of the world, particularly in the global South, a high percentage of GDP comes from money that immigrants to the United States and Europe are sending back home to families. And so the loss of jobs during COVID has therefore had rippling effects to households around the world and reduced financial capital. And disease itself can also trap poor households in debt. And in Latin America, in these fishing communities, predatory lending to pay medical bills has been linked to the over-harvesting of fish as people are just trying to pay their bills off and fishing more and more and more. Social capital has also declined during COVID for all of us, at least for me. With social distancing, we all have less access to networks, to formal and informal groups that provide important resources and safety nets. And then physical capital, which includes the infrastructure that moves goods for sale and consumption, has also declined, as has access to transportation and supply chains, which is especially true for people in more remote and rural communities. During the early months of the pandemic in Kenya, for example, natural gas shortages led to increases in firewood harvesting for charcoal production so people could cook, which is a major driver of deforestation. And so what we see, or what we might be seeing, this is kind of a theoretical framework at the household level, that at an increased reliance on natural capital, might be having negative conservation outcomes in communities around the world as animals and plants are being relied on more and more to meet people's needs. And, potentially actually having, to the extent to which this natural capital is being eroded, which could then have negative consequences for the people who are most reliant on these natural resources, kind of compounding detrimental consequences for livelihoods. And so in the aftermath of the pandemic, investing in robust local social and institutional structures that strengthen households' portfolios of capitals and improve resilience to all types of shocks will probably need to be the way forward. And these kinds of local investments can help change feedback loops between biodiversity and human health, which I've kind of portrayed as spiraling downward and being bad for biodiversity, bad for people. I think there's opportunities to find win-win solutions that promote more healthy ecosystems, healthy human societies, meet goals of conservation and human livelihoods, recreation outdoors. And conservation strategies that consider this coupled nature of human societies and ecosystems can most effectively safeguard biodiversity, address the needs of people, and be more resilient to future shocks. And this kind of framework, this interdisciplinary approach to studying connections between the health of humans, animals, and the environment has formed the cornerstone of this One Health field of research, which we're seeing more and more gaining popularity as kind of a merging of ecology and public health and environmental science. And I anticipate we'll see a lot more of it in the wake of the pandemic. And so, yes, all the work that I presented today was very collaborative with people from all these different disciplines, public health, ecology, sociology. So I want to acknowledge all of my collaborators here, the agencies that I've been collaborating with on the National Parks work, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, which you should all check out. And then also, of course, everyone who contributed to the different stories and anecdotes and studies I presented today. And with that, I'll leave you with this animation of a bear enjoying some human infrastructure on a hot day up in California. And thank you all for joining me.
Thank you so much, Kaitlyn. That was fascinating. So we have some questions for you.
Great, let's do it.
Given the effects of human activity on animals in our parks, do you think we should consider even more restrictions on park visitation?
Yeah, this question, this tension of how, so if we document that visitation in parks is really having these detrimental consequences, what do we do with that information? Especially because the parks are also thinking about how to increase access and increase equity. But I think at some point, park visitation can get so high that it kind of reaches a breaking point where the visitor experience is also suffering too. I don't know if others have had the experience of not being able to find parking at trailheads or being stuck in traffic jams in the park, but it's not really good for anybody. And so some parks like Yosemite has now a reservation system they've implemented still, where you have to have a reservation to get into the park. For some of the more popular parks, that might be the way forward. But I also think that, investing in our state parks, in our local parks, and really making those opportunities, people aware of those opportunities, directing them, perhaps to other areas that are just as beautiful, but perhaps more accessible, is the way to do it. But I also think, that so many of our national parks are set up in such a way where human activity is concentrated in a really small area of the park, that we can probably manage to, maybe we'll take over this area and then leave the rest for wildlife. Maybe that's going to be the way forward.
Thank you. Robert asks, are you aware of any evidence that reduced human activity has had any effect on climate change and therefore on any animals that are particularly susceptible to climate, like coral reefs?
Yeah, so beyond just the kind of the reduction in like human presence in different spaces, there have been a lot of studies out that show that decreased vehicle traffic has led to less noise pollution, to just pollution, and that carbon emissions were down during that period of the shutdown. But I think we're on this trajectory with climate change that the beginning of 2020, it was probably just a little blip that wasn't going to offset like the path that we're on. I think that again, there were some short-term documented, I'm not sure about coral reefs, but, in some animals that are really sensitive to pollution or to noise, there were changes, but I don't know. I think that I really liked the nature is healing, like people are all inside and everything's great, but it was, again, I think it didn't really turn the ship around, but just kind of helped us see that change was perhaps possible if we could.
Thanks. It kind of reminds me that on our Channel Islands, we have spotted skunks, and they're very, very shy, especially when it comes to reproducing. And they found that when there was less human impacts, and sometimes in some cases even less foxes, the skunk population went up because, shy guys need some space.
Definitely, yeah.
Any more questions? Feel free to put them in the question and answer or in the chat. We'll be happy to answer them in just a moment.
Yeah, I could just to riff off what you just said while people are thinking of questions. I think like understanding things like when animals are reproducing, where they prefer to do their reproductive activities, and the effects that humans are having on them can help us make really maybe minor changes. Like if we know that there's a lot of spotted skunks in this particular area, and this is the time of year that maybe a certain trail gets closed, like I don't think it's necessarily like an all or nothing, like we have to completely leave these spaces. I think that an understanding of animal behavior and ecology can help us design more specific interventions that kind of meet everyone's needs.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the conservation efforts that have gone underway in terms of things that we've done with plovers have been a really great example of that as well. Linda wants to know, will human population loss due to COVID have any effect on any of this or not? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, that gets into like a whole other very ethically, morally like the debate about, the human population size and environmental impacts that can, I don't think I have the time or expertise to fully get into here, but, I think I certainly also don't want to I want to acknowledge that like the loss of human life has been terrible and not frame it as like, great, there are fewer people on this planet that, but I don't know. I mean, I still think, human population, it's again, like climate change, human population trends are growing. I think that perhaps tying everything to just human population trends, though, ignores the fact that consumption patterns are not the same across all people on the planet, and that, that it's not necessarily that we need fewer people on this planet. We just need to figure out how to consume less.
Yeah. Sue says, love the story of the otters not wanting humans to come back. Are they still defending their island?
That's a great question. I actually am not sure. I should get back in touch with the folks at Lassen and see how things played out this year. I'm not sure. I think probably not. I think that usually when they establish their den sites, they know where people are active and they'll kind of find a little corner of the lake. But last year, everything was closed. They're like, this seems great. And then all of a sudden there are kayakers and swimmers, and they had already built their nest there. They were there. I like to think that, though, that they're still out there. They haven't ceded their space, but I don't know, we're big and scary.
Well, otters are small and vicious in a lovable way. Robert asks, do you know if there's been a reduction in research grants being made available for research in your area due to budget impacts of the response to COVID-19?
Yeah, that's been a big issue. It's been a big issue, especially for areas where funding is tight in conservation space everywhere, but for places that are perpetually underfunded, areas in Africa, for example, I know that monitoring activities and conservation activities have just kind of come to a halt. Places where they've been tracking wildlife and counting animals for a while, they just don't have the funding anymore. And that monitoring is actually another huge loss that I didn't even talk about, that this interruption in kind of data collection that's happened, both because of the shutdowns and desire to not spread COVID, but in large part just because of the lack of funding. And there's been a lot of funding put more into this kind of One Health, public health, zoonotic disease space, I think now, which is great. But yeah, I think, science is perpetually underfunded, and I fear we're going to see that decline. The good news is that with the change in administration, there is actually more funding, at least at the federal level, for sciences. So that's been good. At least we've got that.
Agreed. Amanda wants to know, what are we seeing locally in our Channel Islands National Park in terms of wildlife impact?
That's a great question. I chatted with some, I'm speaking kind of secondhand, so don't quote me on any of this, but I spoke with some folks out on the islands that were saying that it was a little bit hard to tease apart because at least on Santa Cruz Island, they were doing a huge construction project they were rebuilding the dock where the boats come in. And so actually the campgrounds were full of all the workers, and they didn't actually have that interruption in human activity that we had. You know, there was less like hiking and use of the that area, but that construction project kind of, because I was hoping to use some data that they had on fox movement, but they were saying it wasn't really quite comparable. So at least I know that I can say that the foxes still hung out around the campground. They were eating, just instead of tourist food, they were eating the food of the folks that were working on rebuilding the dock. But yeah, I'd have to direct you to them for the full story on that.
Thank you. Any last questions for Kaitlyn? I have one from Ryan. You mentioned animals catching COVID. Is there a threat that the transcendence to animals will cause more mutations than will in return reinfect people?
Yes, I mean, yeah, in short, I do think though the bigger threat is the mutations that are happening within people already. You know, the virus is getting better and better and better at, you know, infecting humans because it's spreading so quickly in humans. So I think it's more likely that the virus will evolve like targeted, you know, will stay targeted to humans as long as it remains circulating in the human population. But yeah, there are a lot of zoonotic diseases that have wildlife reservoirs that we might eradicate them from human populations. You know, like Ebola, we see these outbreaks from time to time as they flare up. And so yeah, who knows what other coronaviruses are out there. I'm not a disease ecologist, but there are plenty of people out there who are worrying about that question.
Linda asks, what about the wolves and hunting? Any updates there?
Which wolves? I guess
That's a great question. Well, I guess I can say somewhat locally in San Luis Obispo, right? We have our first gray wolf that we've seen in this area of California in a very long time. So that's one data point, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm wondering now. It's a question about the California wolves. Yeah, I don't actually know. I haven't, you know, I don't have like the inside line to what the wolves are doing because I think they're cautious about giving exact locations about where they are. Oh yeah, and the protected listing status. Yeah, I mean, that is again a whole other question that a lot of other people are more qualified to answer. But yeah, that's another debate, but yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks. Tara wants to know, are communities opening hunting and fishing limits under the financial pressures caused by COVID?
I can only speculate on that one too. I mean, we're seeing that basically, I mean, it's established that like as financial pressures grow, more and more people are engaging in more illegal fishing and hunting practices, whether or not the limits are changing. There has been research on fisheries and COVID. I don't have the data for you there now. But certainly I think there's the combination, there's individuals that are trying to meet their kind of financial needs. And then there's also kind of broader economic concerns that are governing these policies. And both of them are going to be impacted by the COVID financial pressures, and everything is. Yeah, sorry, that was a kind of a non-answer, but in short, I'm not sure. Good question.
Right. It looks like that's all the questions we have for you tonight. Thank you so much, Kaitlyn, for joining all of us. And to all of you who are watching tonight, we hope to see you on October 11th for our next Science Pub from home. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.